We're joined by a guest interviewer, Mark Oppenheimer. He's a regular religion columnist for the New York Times, who also writes for Slate, Salon, and Mother Jones. He proudly identifies himself as the only living writer to have contributed to both the Christian Century and Playboy. And today he's talking to vampire novelist Anne Rice. She has quite a story to tell, full of twists and turns, about her journey from vampires to Jesus and back to vampires. Here's Mark Oppenheimer.
Anne Rice is one of the best-selling writers in American history. Author of Interview with a Vampire and its many sequels, her characters have been portrayed in the movies by Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and other very attractive actors. A daughter of New Orleans, she returned there many years after leaving and bought up a little chunk of town, becoming one of its most famous residents, although she now lives in California. And for 50 years, she has been one very hip lady, always with or ahead of her times. She was living in Haight-Ashbury when it was the center of the countercultural universe. She was writing vampires before Twilight. She was pro-gay before network TV had figured out what gay was. Having been raised a strict Catholic, she lost her faith in her teens and then rediscovered it in middle age, which she wrote about in her 2009 book called Out of Darkness. Re-energized by Christianity, she swore off any future vampire books. But then her faith fled as it had before, and the vampires came back. Last October, Knopf published Prince Lestat, a new entry in her ongoing vampire chronicles. So we invited Ms. Rice to catch us up on what happened along the way. Hi, Anne.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I'm going to start by playing a clip from the last interview you did with Interfaith Voices, which was in 2009, when you had just published your memoir called Out of Darkness, about your return to Christianity. So listen up. Here's what you said.
I just decided what would it be like to interview a vampire. So I wrote the book Interview with the Vampire, in which the vampire tells the story to a young interviewer. But the book is really about a lost soul. It's about somebody cast out of life who is struggling to find his way back, to find some form of redemption, to find some place where he fits. And now I see that that was a metaphor for me, that that's the way I felt. I was Louis, that person in the book. And his long, dark search for meaning, which ends in despair, was really me grieving for my lost Catholic faith. And it's a very somber book and a very unlikely bestseller, but it did become a bestseller.
So there you are talking about your first vampire book, Interview with a Vampire, and it was about your lost Catholic faith, and that was what animated it. And yet, now here you are writing about vampires again. So what happened?
Well, I went back to the Catholic Church, as I indicated. I went back in 1998, and what I experienced at that time was an admission that I believed in God. And I went back to the church of my childhood, thinking that that was the best thing to do and the natural thing to do. What happened eventually was that I didn't lose my faith in God again. I still have that faith, and it's very, very strong. And my faith in Jesus Christ is very strong. But I lost my faith in organized religion. So it's possible that I went back to the church only to discover why I had left it in the first place, and to leave it again knowing more about that, why it hadn't worked for me the first time around, and why it wasn't really necessary to me now as a believer in God. I believe in God as much or more than I ever did in my life, and I simply don't believe in going through organized religion at this point.
Okay, but 5 years ago you said to us that your original vampire novel was really a metaphor for your own sense of loss, sense of being cast out into the wilderness.
Yes, that's
now
true.
You're back with the vampires. Are you feeling lost, and are you grieving your loss of organized religion yet again?
I'm seeing them in an entirely different light. They always reflected my spiritual journey. And then for a while there, they didn't. But now they do again. The metaphor works for me still. It works for me as a metaphor for an outsider who is always looking for a way to live outside of the normal conventional ways of living. I've left Catholicism again. I have great affection for it, great affection for all my Catholic friends, my Catholic relatives, my Catholic heritage, but My search for God has got to be outside of organized religion. It's got to be outside of the rules and regulations. I didn't find him there when I went back. Or if I found him, it was only for a short while.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the chronology matters here because in 2009, again, I mean, that was when your book came out. So presumably
Right.
you were writing it in 2007, 2008.
Right.
And it was in 2010 that you wrote on Facebook, "Today I quit being a Christian."
Mm-hmm.
So something happened, you know, pretty dramatically, pretty quickly thereafter, where you said, you know, enough. I have to imagine were there some specific incidents or some specific people who made you rethink the whole organized religion thing?
I don't think it was something dramatic. I think it was something gradual. I think writing the book itself had caused me to confront the fact that I was already halfway out the door. I just didn't know it. I mean, after I wrote that book and published it, I heard from a number of Catholics who told me that it wasn't orthodox. They said, what you've said in there is not what you should have said. You know, at the end of that book, when I talked about God loving everybody, including gay people, and family values involving gay people being real family values, that was not Orthodox Catholic talk. And I got some feedback on that, where they said, you know, you're really not as much a part of this as you think you are. And I took that to heart. But I also knew it was true. I knew in the process of writing and talking about that book that I was experiencing a lot of inner conflict. And what happened in 2010 was I got the courage to admit that I no longer believed in the church as I had tried so desperately to do for 12 years.
But one of the most powerful things about Called Out of Darkness, I think, is that you're admitting up front, look, I'm never going to be an Orthodox Catholic. However, I've discovered that lots of Catholics, indeed most Catholics, are not Orthodox Catholics. I mean, what you were saying was, one reason I can go back to this is because I woke up and looked around and realized most Catholics are using birth control. Many, many Catholics think that gay people are okay with God. That there's a whole community of people who are in no sense Orthodox and yet go to Mass, take communion. So why wasn't that community of people enough?
It wasn't enough because deep inside, I did not believe the theology. I no longer believed it. Now, again, it took me time to admit this. You know, I don't think belief is a choice. I think you either believe something or you don't. You know, I believe there's a tree outside my window, but I don't have a choice about that. I really do believe there's a tree there. But you can lie about belief. You can lie because you want to belong to something so desperately, and you need the comfort of belonging. You can lie about that, or you can ignore the fact that you don't believe. That's what I was doing when it came to theology. Now, something happened in 2010 inside of me where I felt, I have to admit, I really don't believe this. And I felt it was important for me to come out and say, as an author to my readers, I'm quitting this. I am not going to any longer just sit down quietly and live with all the different conflicts and problems here and just give lip service to being a Christian. I'm quitting this group. In Jesus' name, I quit. I refuse to be anti-gay, I refuse to be anti-feminist, and I've stuck by that. You know, now, was that a flip-flop? Yes, that was a flip-flop, but I felt that it was the courageous and right thing to do.
But I don't think it was a flip-flop, because the way I read Called Out of Darkness, you were saying, I'm coming back to the Roman Catholic Church knowing that I don't agree with many of the finer points of its theology, that it teaches any number of things that I think are wrong. But I also realize that millions of other people think they're wrong, and we're all going to go to Mass together, and we're going to be a column within the church that is not theologically orthodox. I mean, I think you were totally upfront about that.
Well, it wasn't enough for me. I mean, I did grow up in a very old-fashioned kind of Catholic atmosphere in New Orleans in the 1940s, and I didn't feel comfortable staying the way you describe it. I mean, you're accurately describing it, and I think there are many, many, many Catholics today who feel just the way you've described. They're not in tune with the theology, and they go to church for various different reasons. And probably if I'd been a private person, not an author, if I hadn't written and talked so much about it, probably I could have lived with it privately too, and might have kept going for social reasons. But I felt the conflict to me was unbearable, so I felt I had to speak up.
When you were last on our show, you told us, I feel reborn as a Christian writer. I feel very energized. Mm-hmm. Now you're saying that in a sense, you were saying that from a place of naivete because there were things you hadn't discovered.
Right.
What were these things that you then discovered? What were these things that then disillusioned you?
I wrote 2 books about the private life of Jesus. They were fictional books. It was the biblical Jesus, the Jesus of tradition, the Jesus of doctrine, but it was his private life. Jesus as a little boy in Nazareth, Jesus as a young man before his baptism in the Jordan. That's what I wrote about. When I confronted what it was going to mean to write about the public life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, when I confronted the shark fest that was going to happen, when I tried to jump in there and write theologically about Jesus and what Jesus actually taught and what he actually meant, I just couldn't get to first base. I couldn't do it. By that time, I'd been studying the Bible for 12 years. I was keenly aware of the huge divisions among Christians. It was really penetrating to me that you cannot just say, I'll leave the theology to God. It's not that easy. I had received letters from all kinds of Christians and Catholics all over the world, some loving, some damning and condemning. I was keenly aware that I would be entering just a bunch of fistfights over what Jesus said, what he meant, what he emphasized, what he did. I couldn't do it. I couldn't write a 3rd book. I couldn't go on with my Christ the Lord series. I still totally am proud of and grateful for the first 2 books. They are, I hope, a significant work, I hope, about the private life of our Lord, about the incarnation, about what it means to be God and man and be a child and be a young man before your ministry. I am so glad that I got to write those books, but there was no way I could continue. There was no way I could get into the fights between born-agains and Catholics and different denominations over what Christianity is really about. I mean, I had grave theological doubts and questions about all of it. I really, the more I learned, the more I was out the door.
We're hosting a conversation today between vampire novelist Anne Rice and New York Times religion writer Mark Oppenheimer. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Interfaith Voices. Today we're talking to Anne Rice, best known for her 1976 novel, Interview with the Vampire, and her series of books about the fashionably undead, revolving around a chic, gray-eyed vampire named Lestat. When I interviewed Anne Rice in 2009, she had abandoned atheism and returned to the Catholicism of her youth, committing herself to chronicling the life of Jesus. She had just written a memoir about her new embrace of Christianity, titled Called Out of Darkness. And here's a bit of what she told me.
I surrendered. I said, in effect, to the Lord, I believe in you and I know you know the answers. If I regret anything, it's that I didn't keep talking to the Lord, that I didn't take the problems to him.
But Anne Rice has had a profound change of heart. As she tells us today, her faith didn't stick.
You can lie about belief. You can lie because you want to belong to something so desperately, and you need the comfort of belonging. You can lie about that, or you can ignore the fact that you don't believe.
So what happened? To find out, we've brought in a guest interviewer, Mark Oppenheimer. He writes the Beliefs column for the New York Times and also reports for The Atlantic, The Nation, and This American Life. Let's get back to their discussion.
You also write about having quit drinking cold turkey, when you were you in your 30s?
1979, I was, 38, I guess, 39 years old, something like that, yeah.
And that was a decision you and your late husband made together, if I
We did.
recall right.
Mm-hmm, we did.
And then you lapsed back into drinking once, and then never again since?
Right, yeah, the same summer, the same year, 1979, but never after 1979, never. I don't regret that decision at all.
And you're still on the wagon? No drinking since?
Oh, totally, yeah. I was an incredible drunk. Yeah, I mean, I finished early.
you drank enough by 39 that you never had to drink.
Exactly.
Here's a question. What about communion? Do you take the wine at communion if you're sober?
I Actually, I did take the wine at a wedding once, a communion wine at a wedding. I was the matron of honor, and I did it. But normally, I wouldn't take the wine. No, but I don't have any particular fear of that type of thing.
I remember thinking when I read that you were an ex-alcoholic or a non-drinking alcoholic that that drinking was very much of a piece with your whole aesthetic, with the vampires, the drinking of the blood, with your love for the Eucharist, with having grown up in this kind of sensuous New Orleans Catholicism. And I wondered if giving up drinking after you'd already become a published author, if it affected your art at all. Did sobriety affect your writing?
I don't know if I can judge that. I was already not drinking while writing. Even I had sense enough not to drink and write at the same time. And I would say that it did not affect my writing, except maybe to make it better, that I wasn't spending so much energy trying to contain the life of a drunk and be a writer at the same time. You put a lot of energy into that, I think, living the life of a drunk, pretending to be sober, being, careful to be just so drunk and not any drunker. And when you get rid of all that, it's really wonderfully liberating. You have a lot of energy and a lot of time on your hands.
Did it improve your marriage to stop drinking?
I think so, yeah, probably did. I was married for 41 years, and it was such a wonderful, stormy love affair that I can't say what improved it or made it better or worse at any time. It was, I only loved one man in my life, and that was Stan Rice, and it was wonderful,
Did he ever become a little more Catholic again with you?
No, Stan was an atheist completely and entirely. He never believed anything, not that I know of.
But I wonder if he, as an atheist, worried a little bit that you'd gone off your rocker when you went back to Catholicism.
He was very respecting of it, but I think he did think that. I think he did. But he was very respecting of this is what you want to do, and he did. I resisted getting in arguments with him about it. In those early days, as I said, I was feeling the consolation, and I really thought theological arguments didn't matter, that God would handle all that. We didn't have to know the answers. God knew the answers. And I really believed that. By the time I left again, of course, Stan had been gone for 8 years. And it wasn't because of arguments with anyone else. I left because of arguments with myself.
Has Pope Francis tempted you back into the church a little bit?
No, but I think he's wonderful, and I think he's caused a lot of other people to go back, and I think it's great. I think he's pulled the rug out from under the American arch-conservatives, and they're a bit confused. But I think the mainstream Catholics in America and everywhere are very happy with him, and he's bringing a lot of people back. That's what people tell me on Facebook. Every time I post a story about Pope Francis, people say, I love him, I think he's great, or I had left, but this man could bring me back, etc., etc.
So what would bring you back? Would anything?
I don't think so, because I don't theologically believe the heart of it. I don't believe you have to belong to it to be saved. So I don't think anything would bring me back.
Do you think there'll be more vampires down the road in your books?
Yes, I do. I think vampires have always been an effective way for me to talk about my spiritual journey. I'll tell you something. Even after I wrote the Christ the Lord books, one or two very religious people told me that they thought I did a better job in the vampire novels of talking about the same thing. And I was very struck at the time. I thought, what are you talking about? What do you mean? But they told me that. One person said that specifically. You did a better job in Memnoch the Devil with your vampire Lestat than you did in Christ the Lord out of Egypt in talking about God. And that was a born-again Christian who told me that. The other person was a Catholic priest. He put it more gently. He never responded to the two Christ novels, but he said of the vampires, he said, I miss those characters.
And do you think it's because they're mapping a kind of correspondence between Lestat or Lewis or any of them onto Christ, or is it just a general kind of compassion for the outsider or the lost or the person on some sort of pilgrimage?
I can articulate my loneliness and my cosmic uncertainty when I speak through Lestat or Louis. I can get into their skin, and I can talk about being damned and condemned by people, and yet feeling that I want to live a meaningful life. I can wrestle with guilt. I can talk about all the things that matter the most to me when I'm talking through those characters.
And do you think that Lestat looks like Brad Pitt?
Well, Brad Pitt actually played Louis,
Oh, I'm sorry.
The vampire Louis was actually me.
I forgot.
I am the only woman who's ever been played in a movie by Brad Pitt. And no,
I was so young when the movie
all.
came out. I was so did those actors work for you?
Yeah, they did a fine job. They really did. They made those characters famous all over the world. They did. Neil Jordan directed a terrific movie there, and both those actors did a superb job. Even now, all these years later, 20 years later, when people talk about Lestat, there'll be a picture of Tom Cruise up there in his costume and wig as Lestat or Brad Pitt as Louis.
A question about your happiness. In Called Out of the Darkness, you write that there was a priest whom you had told about your very Catholic upbringing, how you'd gone to Mass daily and the Catholic schools and your neighborhood. And he said to you, well, if you were brought up like that, you'll never be happy outside the church. For a Catholic like you, there is no life outside the Catholic Church. Well, obviously there is life outside the Catholic Church, and you found it and you're making it. But do you believe that there was a certain kind of happiness you found within it that you've had to let go of to live more honestly outside of it?
Yes, you put that perfectly. I let go of that happiness.
All right. Anne Rice, thank you so much for your time. It was really fun talking to you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Anne Rice is the author of multiple novels on witches, wolves, and vampires, and a few on the life of Jesus. Her newest book is called Prince Lestat, the 11th installment of her series, The Vampire Chronicles. She's been talking to Mark Oppenheimer, the beliefs columnist for the New York Times. I want to thank both of them for joining us today. Next, we're joined by a guest interviewer, Mark Oppenheimer. He's a regular